Hello everyone and welcome to episode 85 in the series. This one is knit together at last because I finished the blanket and I'm excited to share that finished object with you guys. I also have some more knitting woolly history for you and a giveaway from one of our viewers, Celeste, that sent a lovely book in, so I'm excited to have that for a giveaway today. Let's see, what else should I tell you? You can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, on obviously on YouTube, on Ravelry, Instagram, and on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com. And over there, that's where I usually put the show notes up. So if I talk about patterns, if I talk about links, if I talk about anything, it's going to be over in the show notes. And I have a quick update for those of you, a lot of you are coming back. Welcome back, it's nice to see you. And for those of you who are new, I'm a professor at the university here in town in Urbana, Illinois, and I teach a science fiction class, speculative fiction, science technology studies, all that good stuff. But I've been putting videos up for my science fiction class, a kind of separate podcast series, and I know a few of you have gone over to watch them. Thank you, that's wonderful, I hope you enjoy them. But I've just done a shadow version of it over on YouTube, so the links for that are also in the show notes. If you're interested in science fiction, we've just done Frankenstein, and now we're moving on to the pulps, and then we're going to do aliens. So if that's up your alley, you can check out the alternate cast either through Illinois Media Space, which is the first link, or I've now put a link up on for a YouTube channel that just has the science fiction stuff, for those of you who are nerds like me. Okay, so what should I tell you? Updates. Yeah, the hand, it's healing. Those of you, thank you for all your messages, all of your admonishments that I should go to the doctor. I did not go to the doctor. It is healing up very slowly, but surely. It's been about 4 weeks now, going on 5 weeks. And yes, I wear my brace most of the time when I'm knitting or out doing anything, my little homemade brace. But it's been doing really well, and thanks to some of you who offered advice about making sure that I keep things moving in a gentle way. So I've been gently doing some little joint things that don't cause me any pain. The knitting's been going slow. I worked on the blanket, but I've also switched over to bigger needles and different kinds of projects, and that has helped a little bit. So while the sweaters aren't happening at the moment, I have been doing other knitting things, and I actually have what I think will be a new hat pattern, hopefully in the next week or so. I mean, I'm finishing up the prototype now, and I'm going to do it just as a free pattern because it was inspired by a couple of other things that I saw out in the world. So there'll be a free hat pattern coming out in the next, hopefully, a week or so. Maybe I'll get some test knitters for that. That would be kind of fun. There's an idea. I'll let you know. Okay, so what am I wearing? I usually tell you, it's like woolly season. It's like sweater season now. So I have my Bisou on. This was a sweater I just finished pretty recently. This was from Amirasu magazine's latest issue, and I did some modifications on this, and I'll put a link in the show notes to the episode where I talk about this sweater in case you're interested in learning more about it. Beautiful sweater. This one I knit out of New Zealand wool, Maniatoto wool. And Maniatoto, actually, Mary she retired. She passed the business on to a new lovely young woman named Hannah, and if you're interested in Maniatoto wool, it is going to be in Hannah's good hands, and I'm excited to see what she does with the company and with all the dyeing in the wool and everything else. So yeah, so that's what I'm wearing. It's a nice reminder of like connections across the world and the community. And since we're talking about the Knit Together project today, it just seems fitting, right? So yeah, let me show you the blanket, which is I'm keeping it in this amazing bag by Bags by Awesome Granny. I love her bags. This is one she sent me a little while ago, and it's a new version of some of her of her other bags because it's a really tall kind of tote bag, and look at that, it fits an entire blanket. That's amazing. She does like lining on the inside. This is her tag, Bags by Awesome Granny. Love the thing. I mean, seriously, an entire blanket in a bag, that's crazy. So this is the Knit Together project blanket. It is done, it is seamed, it is bordered, it is squishy, and it makes me think of all of you who sent in squares. So many wonderful people sent in squares for this blanket. I think we ended up with 28 different people sent in squares from around the world. So let me stand up and show you the blanket, because I'm going to put some photos in here, but I think it kind of, you get a good sense of it this way. It's really beautiful. It has all kinds of variation in color and pattern and style, and it's a big blanket. Like it's almost touching my toes right now, and it's up to my chest, obviously, so I could lay down under it if I wanted to. It's a beautiful, beautiful spread of squares, and there are so many good memories associated with this blanket for me, because when I started it, as I said in the last episode, I just first sent the needles to a few podcasters that I knew, and so they then traveled all around to podcasters and other people that they knew. So it's just been a wonderful kind of collection of community here. I see just right off the bat, like this is Tommy Trujillo's square she's from Squirrel Pie Productions. I know Kate, I think this is Kate's square from Hawthorne Cottage Craft podcast. This is Shirley Young, who's up in Chicago. She's an old blog friend. I know Mandy's square is in here. And Mandy is another old blog friend, back when I started the blog in like 2015. Louise of Knitting Poppy, she's on social media. There's this guy. Who else is in here? Ninja Chickens. Maria is this beautiful square. So many of you. I know Rachel of Treehouse Knits is in here, and I'm not going to be able to pull her square right now, but so many of you have squares in here. And so it's been a wonderful, thing to work on this and to see all your squares and to sew them up and to think about all of you. So thank you so much for sending them in and participating. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what it's like to put together one of these blankets, and then I want to talk to you about whether or not you want to do one with your guild or your community or your podcast buddies or whatever, and I would love to feature any knit together projects that you guys do on the podcast. So if you're interested, I'll put a little note over in the show notes about how to get involved, and we'll set up a Ravelry thread. And if you guys have groups that you want to do this with, near or far, put together your blankets or your pillows or your whatever it is that you want to do together as a community, and I will gladly feature them on the podcast and over on the blog. So one of the major things about putting together a blanket like this is that I asked for 8x8 squares, and people were wonderfully good about trying to come up with 8x8 squares. But people were also knitting with different sized needles, different kinds of fibers, different patterns on the squares. So many different variations are built in here, which is wonderful, but it's also for the sewer-upper, it's a little bit more complicated than just maybe your standard blanket that you knit by yourself with the same needles over and over again. So one of the first things to think about is how to make these squares fit together, and which ones are more stretchy and which ones need to be modified and all that kind of good stuff. I ended up with only 2 squares that needed to be slightly modified. Unfortunately for me, they were both knit on the bias, which means they were started in one corner and they were increased to their largest point and then decreased to the other corner. So it wasn't as simple as just pulling out a few rows on the top. But I managed, and that was, let's see, there's one kind of near the edge here. Yeah. So Louise's beautiful square was just ended up a little bit too big. So on the back, I tacked it down very gently on both sides, and I think that came out just fine. It looks just great, and it was like a little quick mod that I needed to do for just a couple of the squares. But there were other squares that posed different issues to think about in terms of getting crafty and creative. So this beautiful square from Danya Turner, for example, I love this one, has a little bit of a bias thing going on at the bottom. It has these points on the ends, and so I paired it up with a square like this from Kate Boyd, and her square was extra squishy, and I was able to use the extra fabric in this square to kind of follow the lines of Danya's square. So they kind of work together really nicely, and I'll show you that on the back. You can see the points coming together with the other square there. And so it worked out really well that some of these squares had a little bit more stretch and give than others, and that even the ones that had different kinds of edgings, I was able to incorporate them fully into the blanket without any holes or gaps, which I think is pretty cool. Now, as far as joining them together, I used a basic mattress stitch. You'll notice on the front, especially even on the white squares, there's nothing that shows, because mattress stitch is amazing and miraculous in that way, and it just disappears into the blanket based on the way that you do it, so that's pretty cool. The other thing I did was to try to figure out a border for this blanket, because when it was just all the squares together, it was beautiful enough, but it needed something to kind of pull it together. And I think as I stood up here, you can probably see there's a lot of like grays, whites, kind of natural tones in the blanket, along with these really bright, beautiful pops of color. So I ended up going with a gray wool for the border, and this is an Icelandic wool from Feederbrook Farm. That's Lisa. Lisa over at Feederbrook Farm has some beautiful sheep. And a long time ago, I bought a bunch of yarn from Lisa, a lot of different breeds and a lot of her kind of cast-offs from some of the education sessions she was doing. So they were yarns that she had dyed while teaching, and she was just looking to get rid of like a big batch of them. So I bought a bunch of that, and included in the batch was some Icelandic yarn. And I remember when I first encountered the Icelandic, which I'll show you here in the... It's not a yarn that's super stretchy, as many of you know who might have worked with Icelandic wool. So, for example, if you look at the yarn itself, this is a 2-ply, it doesn't really have a lot of stretch or elasticity to it. So I thought to myself, well, this would be good for rugs or blankets or weaving. And I'm not a big weaver, though we do have a loom and Spencer weaves sometimes. So initially this was kind of earmarked for his weaving. And I just thought, you know, that's the perfect kind of yarn for this blanket because it has a good story behind it. It's from Lisa, Feederbrook Farm, and it's Icelandic. It's something that's been in my stash for a while that I've been looking for like the perfect use for. So I went with that for the border, and I think the border just really pulls the whole thing together. There's something about that gray that you can kind of see almost inflected in each of the squares, or it plays off them in a really beautiful way. So that's the border, and I went with a simple garter stitch and about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and I just did one side and one side, and then I picked up the top and the bottom. Now picking up stitches for this is also a little bit tricky because, again, all the squares are different. They have different gauges, they have different fibers, different fabrics are created. Some are extra elastic on the edge, some have a really hard kind of edge to pick up on. So picking up stitches was definitely something to think about. And what I ended up doing is just going with my intuition, and that's from, you know, years of knitting. But thinking about the difference between a square like this, where I'm picking up along actually a folded edge here, versus a square like this, where I'm picking up along an actual finished edge, and both of them have different gauges, different yarns, different fibers. So I went with my intuition, and generally speaking, I went with like a pick up 2 for every 3 or 3 for every 4 rows, basically. And you can see that the nice thing about skipping the rows, which you need to because stitches are, let's see, I always like get this mixed up. Stitches are longer than they are wide, wider than they are long. Anyway, you need fewer, I'm so bad at this. Like the conceptualization is really difficult sometimes. But basically you need to pick up fewer stitches this way than you do if you were going this way. Anyway, complicated. So I went for like every 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 rows, but that didn't always work. And so you just kind of have to guess and gauge what's going on, because what you don't want is any kind of puckering. Like you don't want this to be gathered because you didn't pick up enough stitches, and you also don't want it to be flared out because you picked up too many stitches, right? So generally speaking, if you go with a 2/3, 3/4 kind of model, you're going to be okay. And that tended to work here. So I think this border is lovely that way. I went with a super kind of stretchy bind off, which actually involves a yarn over. And that way the end of this, the edge of this, has a little bit of give to it, and it's not gonna pull the rest of the blanket in. So that's it for the Knit Together blanket. I am so excited that it's done, and as promised, it is to be given to one of the square makers. And I did a random draw of the 28 people that submitted squares, and Mandy Kine was the winner. Mandy is the author of the Little Golden Notebook blog, or she was. It's switched over now, I think. And let's see, I showed you Mandy's square. Mandy Square is down here. It's this beautiful little bias number, knit up in a brown wool. And so this whole blanket is off to Mandy. Congratulations on winning the blanket. I hope it keeps you very warm and cozy for many years to come. And I will also send along some of the stories that go along with the wool so that you have those as you're wrapping up in it. You can think about all the wonderful people in the community who contributed to this blanket and made it possible. So thank you to everyone. This was quite a community undertaking, and I appreciate that you all had the patience to wait for me to come back to it after a couple of years. As I said, if you're interested in getting involved in a Knit Together project with your community, now seems to be the right time, given a lot of divisions in the country and around the world, and get the pandemic and everything. So if you're interested in getting involved in a Knit Together project with your community, either near or far, let me know. Head over to the Ravelry group and tell us about it on the Ravelry thread, and I will gladly feature any Knit Together project, whether they're blankets or other kinds of projects, weaving, whatever it is. Yeah, I'll feature them on the blog and on the podcast, and it'll be a nice way for us to think about the community and keeping people together and using knitting as a way to kind of get through these harder times, right? Yeah, so that's my finished object. I'm going to throw some pictures up if I haven't already and send this off to Mandy. So, yay! And as promised, I have a knitting woolly history section, as we've been doing for the last few casts. This time around, I thought I was going to do the Canada Knits book, but I've been doing research for my own new book this past week, so I didn't have as much time as I had hoped I'd have. So I thought I'd give you a little bit more from Peggy Hart's book on wool. Last time we talked about the colonial period in American history, and this time I thought we'd talk about the 19th century and kind of Civil War era and westward expansion. A couple of really interesting things that came out of this section of the book, and I think you'll enjoy hearing about them. So in case you missed the last cast, Peggy Hart is an experienced weaver. She's kind of traveled the world, and this book is an overview of the wool industry in America between about the colonial period and up through the 1980s. And so I'm going to just focus in, like I said, on the 19th century today, because I think there are some little bits and bobs in here that you'll really appreciate. So the 19th century is really interesting for wool in America because we have the confluence of a bunch of different things happening. Early in the century, we have Congress approving overland roads, and by 1869 we have the Transatlantic Railroad. So we have a lot of opportunities for transportation, moving people and moving sheep and moving wool and fleece products around the country. But we also have at the same time, of course, westward expansion, which immediately affects indigenous peoples and the Native Americans in the US out in the West, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We also have an influx of sheep, we have the Civil War, and we have a bunch of different tariff acts that are trying to control where wool is produced and how much imported wool comes into the country. So there's tons of different things happening in the 19th century, and that's why it makes it a pretty interesting time for American wool. It's also kind of like a heyday for American wool. For example, in 1870, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, according to Peggy Hart, were 4 of the top 6 wool producer states in the United States. That's, I mean, this is like Midwest. And then after that, you really find the sheep in the West becoming like the major kind of source for wool in the US. So let's take this a little bit like a piece at a time. Let's talk first about the movement of sheep. So in 1844, Peggy Hart says there were about 50,000 sheep moving out west. That's a lot of sheep. It's not, I mean, compared to what it becomes, it's not a lot, but that's a good first movement of sheep. By the 1860 census, she says, there were 22.4 million sheep, and only about a quarter of those were out east. So 3/4 of those 22.4 million sheep were out west in places like Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Texas. And so that becomes a huge kind of center for wool. We know that the churro sheep, which were introduced by the Spanish, were bred with merinos and moved to down to Texas. It became a big kind of like hub for that interbred sheep that's where we get the merinos mixed in for one of the first times, I believe. And that's between the 1830s and the 1860s. So we've got all these sheep kind of like moving west. We've got the introduction of the roads and the railroads so that the wool can come back east to the mills. And so we've got a pretty good system in the country as far as wool production and then, you know, wool manufacture, right? And we've got the Civil War in the middle of all this. In 1865, the war is over, but the war drove a lot of the wool production because soldiers needed everything from socks to uniforms to blankets. So there was a huge uptick in the amount of wool that was needed, like from the government's perspective, because of the Civil War. Now, right after the Civil War, we have the wool industry is actually one of the nation's most important sources of income, which is pretty incredible. And she says, the Civil War ended in 1865, leaving the nation with a national debt of $4 billion. At this time, the wool industry was one of the nation's most important sources of internal revenue, only exceeded by distilled liquor, iron, and tobacco. So wouldn't it be interesting if now wool was still that huge of a part of like the GDP of the country? But it's not, sadly. The trouble is that right after that, you know, we have this huge influx with the Civil War and uniforms and soldiers, and then it starts to drop off. And that's in part because we start to get all this imported wool that's cheaper from Australia and New Zealand, where there's millions and millions of sheep more than we have in this country. And so you get things like the 1867 Woolens Act, which imposed a high tariff on imported wool, and you get the 1890 McKinley Tariff Act, which was inspired partially by the Wool Growers Association lobby, and that was to keep place higher tariffs on wool that was imported so that American-grown wool would be the main wool that was being used in the country. And actually the Wool Growers Association of America offered, as she says, the wool growers offered McKinley an American-made and grown wool suit for his inauguration in 1896 after they lobbied to get that tariff passed. Pretty interesting stuff. So at the same time, and a little bit before this, we have massive effect of this industry and wool and sheep and westward expansion on indigenous peoples in this country. So between 1840 and 1890, as Peggy Hart notes, the Native American population was reduced by more than half, and that's because of westward expansion. Native Americans were being moved onto reservations. We're getting disease. I mean, it's a horrible time for indigenous peoples in this country at the same time as there's this huge expansion of wool and manufacture and industry from the perspective of the colonizing American government. So between 1863 and 1864, for example, we have someone like Kit Carson, who's a big westward expansion fur trader kind of guy. She says Kit Carson decimated the Navajo herds, obliterating Churro bloodlines. Dodd, the Indian agent who was working with the Navajo in particular, estimated that in 1866 there were only 1,100 sheep left and recommended a restoration of at least 12,000. So beginning in 1869, the Indian Service issued 2 sheep or goats per person as part of this treaty settlement, and by 1878 there were 700,000 sheep on the Navajo reservation, and she says the animals along with the annual annuity yarn enabled Navajo weavers to return to the craft of weaving. And that's an interesting story because, I mean, you have to remember that the Americans who were moving west were the ones who messed everything up to begin with. So just the fact that we gave back some sheep and some goats doesn't rectify the situation in any way. So that's why I say that the 19th century is pretty interesting for wool and wool production in the United States, because we have all of this stuff happening with transport, we have stuff happening with the Civil War and the wool market, we have tariffs, we have the obliteration of Churro sheep in the West, and then we have the revival of and kind of reintegration of Churro, Merino, and Shropshire sheep as part of that restoration movement. So we've got a lot going on in the 19th century, and that's why I thought it would be worth it to at least bring us up that far with Peggy Hart's book before we move on. And I wanted to note that if anybody's interested in thinking more about the West, I came across this book. It's called The Woolly West, Colorado's Hidden History of Sheepscape Landscapes, and it's by Andrew Gulliford. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's supposed to be a kind of history of the ways that when sheep were driven out into the public lands, especially out in Colorado because of the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, what happens with some of the challenges of getting animals on public lands, and whether or not, you know, there was agreement between the different kinds of shepherds, the longhorn sheep and the other sheep, and what's going on out there. Plus, Gulliford talks a little bit about the sheepscapes and some of the markings on trees and things that are out west that one can go check out. And they had different meanings they were like ways of communicating between different shepherds and all kinds of different things. So here's, for example, some of those tree markings that he's talking about. So anyway, haven't read it yet. It's on my list, and I think it's a kind of nice complement to bringing us even more up to date into the 20th century, since I was just talking about the 19th century and the West and what happens with sheep. So there you go. All right, that's your knitting history segment for the week. The last little bit here is a giveaway from Celeste. Celeste Garcia was kind enough to contact me, and she had an extra copy of Inspired by Isla, which is a Kate Davies book. And on the first knitting history segment, I featured one of Kate Davies' books, her Yokes book. So Celeste thought this would be absolutely appropriate to send this in. Inspired by Isla is a beautiful book that came out in 2016, I believe. Let me see. 2017. And it's all about Isla itself, which is one of the Scottish Isles. So this one has 12 patterns. Each of them is inspired by a different place on the island. And there's some beautiful essays in the beginning about Isla and the kind of landscape, ecology, crafters who are working there, and just beautiful photography by Kate's husband, who's a wonderful photographer. And one of the essays that I really remember reading and loving was this one called The Geological Map of Isla by Jane Hunter. And she is a crafter who makes these beautiful fabric representations of things that are going on the island ecologically and geologically. So really cool essay. And the patterns in here are gorgeous. There's sweaters, socks, blankets, hats, and one of my favorites, I remember Sarah Fibertrack was working on this one, the Ua sweater, for quite a while. Beautiful color work sweater. So yeah, tons of different kinds of patterns, little cowls, cardigans, wraps, you know, just you name it, it's in here, and they're beautiful. Hats, fun stuff. So Celeste, thank you so much for sending this. And what Celeste and I would like you to do if you want to enter to win this book is to please leave a comment here on the Ravelry thread or over on the blog post for this episode, telling us maybe something about how craft of any kind, whether it's knitting, crochet, sewing, gardening, you name it, whatever it is, but how craft of any kind has kind of helped you through the pandemic and kept you kind of hopeful maybe, or just given you some peace. We'd love to know what you're making, what you're doing, and how it's working for you in this crazy time in the world. So that's all we ask, and then one of you guys will win this by random draw in a couple of weeks. So yeah, thank you, Celeste, so much. It's wonderful to have a community out there that's interested in giving stuff away and passing things on to other folks to use and read, so thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that's probably about it. I hope you all are doing okay, and I love hearing from you. I heard from so many of you when I started this knitting history segment, and I'd love to hear from more of you. And I look forward to talking to you and hanging out on the next cast. In the meantime, take care and be well, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care.